South Korea today is a world-recognized industrial producer, all from very humble beginnings.
I recall very well when I was going out there, my colleagues had very little optimism about the South Korean economy. It was heavily aid-dependent, had gone through political turmoil. They didn't see the resources. And when getting there, many Koreans felt the same way, that their future was very bleak.
Yet, though many believed it impossible, South Korea successfully industrialized. The core of the economic miracle that was South Korea's economic rise was heavy and chemical industry, the commanding heights. South Korean government since the 1950s under Seungman Rhee had planned to nurture HCI. But the U.S. response to such ambitions was cool. Indeed, the United States was negative about the very idea of South Korea's industrializing. U.S. policymakers believed it best if South Korea focused on agriculture, where it had comparative advantage, and import industrial goods from Japan. The governments of Rhee and his successors, Chang Myon and Park Chung-hee, saw HCI as the only way to achieve economic self-sufficiency. In January 1962, the new government of Park Chung-hee set out a 5-year economic plan in which it envisioned not only the construction of 4 hydroelectric power plants and 8 thermal power plants, but also fertilizer, oil refining, cement, combined steel, machine tools, shipping and automobile producing facilities, i.e., every major area of heavy industry. But without necessary technological capabilities and funds, such plans remained on the drawing board. The United States demanded that target growth rates be reduced and that excessive investment plans, like the integrated steelworks, be shelved. The Park Chung-hee government was forced to back down. Much of the more ambitious parts of the plan were scrapped, leaving only the oil refinery and the fertilizer factory. To begin with, in 1962, the government created a state oil company, and with investment from the U.S. Gulf Oil Company, as well as loans, built a refinery in Ulsan. Soon after, 2 fertilizer factories were also constructed. There were already 2 fertilizer plants in operation, but they did not produce enough to meet the country's needs. Thus, in the 1965 to 1967 period, fertilizer plants were constructed in Ulsan and in Jinhae. Thanks to experience already gained, both plants were constructed quickly and soon operated above expected capacity.
South Korea built 2 state-of-the-art fertilizer plants. They're big, beautiful plants. Put them on stream a year ahead of schedule. So I went to see the Minister of Science and Technology, and I said, how'd you do that? I mean, how did you build 2 state-of-the-art plants a year ahead of schedule? Where did that come from? Oh, he said, you remember the Cheongju fertilizer plant? I said, oh gosh, that terrible, terrible project. He says, to you it was a terrible project. But every engineer in South Korea cut his teeth on the Cheongju fertilizer plant. We know more about fertilizer plants than anybody else in the world.
A private fertilizer plant was also built. Samsung's Lee Byung-chul obtained a $40 million loan from Japan's Misui Corporation and built a massive fertilizer plant in Ulsan, planning an annual production capacity of 330,000 tons. Refining and fertilizer producing capacity had been but a part of the initial proposed 5-year plan. Further HCI capacity would require foreign currency in order to import capital goods and raw materials. The Park Chung-hee government focused all its energies on obtaining foreign currency. In December 1964, Park's visit to West Germany resulted in agreements for $40 million of government and commercial loans. But this was not enough. There was a need to find other ways to begin in massive foreign capital. Those were to be the normalization of relations with Japan and the Vietnam War. Normalization of South Korean-Japanese relations had been under discussion since 1951. There had been 5 summits in the 10 years preceding the coup of 1961, but the 2 sides had failed to reach agreement. Park Chung-hee's government pursued normalization as a matter of urgency in order to so-called claimable funds. Finally, in November 1962, the head of the Korean CIA, Kim Jong-pil, and Japanese Foreign Minister, Ohira Masayoshi, agreed that Japan would pay $300 million in grants and $300 million in the form of loans. But in the spring of 1964, as Park's government rushed to normalize relations, opposition parties and students began to express their anger at what they saw as a shameful policy and a disgrace to the nation.
우리 국민들은 박정희 정부가 일본과 과거사 문제를 유보한 채 안보적인 협력 또는 경제적인 협력만을 추구하는 것에 대해서 대단히 비판적이었습니다.
Student protests started to grow. In response, on 3rd June 1964, the government declared martial law in Seoul. Opposition protests were suppressed. A year later, in June 1965, the Korean-Japanese Treaty of Normalization was signed. $800 million as reparation fund. A massive sum given that South Korean exports were only $119 million at the time. These funds allowed South Korea to import much-needed capital, advanced technology and know-how from Japan.
일본하고의 수교를 하게 될 경우에는 많은 개발 자금을 얻어낼 수 있다고 하는 점을 파악하고 있었고, 또 미국과 일본과 안보적인 협력을 공고히 함으로써 북한의 위협을 막아낼 수 있다 이렇게 판단했기 때문에
The deployment of troops to Vietnam was another major foreign currency earner. In 1964, the United States decided to escalate the war in Vietnam and requested the deployment of South Korean forces. Expecting that deployment would result in multiple benefits, including the maintenance of the U.S. Army's deployment in Korea, as well as the modernization of the South Korean Army, salary incomes for South Korean soldiers, and other workers sent to Vietnam. The government agreed to deploy forces. Unlike the normalization issue, opposition parties did not oppose the deployment, with the media being in favor. Students also did not protest. In fact, many enlisted in order to be deployed.
사러 올 수 있겠나 이런 걱정이 돼 있는데 또 이면에는 내가 가가지고 이제 사러 오게 되면은 우리 농촌에 아버지, 어머니, 할아버지, 할머니 정말 농토 얼마 안 되는 걸 가지고 어렵게 사시는데 뭐 땅에 따라 한두 마리 사주면은 삶이 좀 나아질 것이고 또 그게 안 되면은 송아지 따나 한 몇 마리 사가 이래 해주면 그때 소가 이제 상당히 재산몽동 뭐 일용 안 되겠습니까? 이러면 집에 살기가 좀 안 낫겠나? 설마 내가 거기서 뭐 죽겠나? 내 사러 오자 이런 이용기를 가지고 대다수 그런 마음으로 갔습니다. 그때 하도 사회 상황이 어렵고 하니까 그렇지 그래 가게 됐습니다.
A security battalion and an engineering battalion were soon followed by 20,000 troops from the backbone of the armed forces, including the Tiger Battalion of the Army and the Blue Dragon Battalion of the Marines. In 1966, an entire division that included the White Horse Battalion was also deployed. Thus, total military deployment to Vietnam reached 310,000. Of those deployed, 5,000 were killed in action and 11,000 injured. Another 80,000 were injured as a result of defoliants. Thanks to their sacrifice, South Korea received substantial assistance from the United States. In the 1966 Brown Memorandum, the United States promised to aid the modernization of the South Korean armed forces, pay personnel and equipment expenses for South Korea's military deployment in Vietnam. It also agreed to buy all such equipment in South Korea, as well as procuring some U.S. Army equipment from South Korea too. U.S. also helped Korea to establish an industrial institute. Korea government created the Korean Institute of Science and Technology. And it encouraged Korean specialists residing overseas to return. They greatly contributed to the state-propelled development of HCI in the 1970s.
우리나라에서 만든 바지가 월남으로 수출돼서 사이공 항구에 도착했습니다.
The Vietnam deployment led to a surge in exports. Foreign currency earnings from the pay of soldiers and workers sent to Indochina, as well as Korean contractors there, totaled $740 million. Money earned through blood spent. With the U.S.-Korean-Japanese security alliance consolidated, foreign capital inflows began to increase rapidly. Foreign loans did not reach the $40 million mark in 1965. In 1969, however, they exceeded $500 million. Private companies formed a line to get permission to take out foreign loans. Foreign capital could transform businesses. Foreign loans were guaranteed by the banks, and by the late 1960s, the size of such guaranteed money exceeded loan balance of the banks. The government used foreign currency accumulated from the normalization and the Vietnam deployment to begin work on petrochemical works in Ulsan and a combined steelworks in Pohang. At the time, with the development of chemical fiber industry, there was a need for domestic supply of raw materials. Hence, the Park government undertook a plan to construct a petrochemical industry. The petrochemical industry involved making basic products like ethylene and naphtha in oil refinery, from which the industry via intermediate products yielded polyester, acrylic, etc. Petrochemicals created the inputs for light industry. The connection between the various products of the petrochemical industry meant that there was a need to concentrate all related facilities in one location. Thus, the plan was to build a complex in Ulsan with an area of around 1 million pyong. Given low domestic demand, it was decided that facilities to produce 100,000 tons of ethylene would first be constructed. For such a facility to be viable, large amounts of state assistance would be acquired. The government helped the project with aid in a variety of forms, including subsidized raw materials and a variety of tax breaks, sparing no expense. Major projects, such as the construction of the naphtha cracking plant, were entrusted to state companies like State Oil Refinery Company and Cheongju Fertilizer. Private companies, as yet, lacked the capacity. In October 1972, after 4 years and investment totaling $250 million, the Ulsan petrochemical complex was complete, and the supply of needed inputs dramatically improved. At a combined steelworks, iron ore and coke are melted down in a furnace to make cast iron. Carbon is removed from the cast iron in order to make steel. From here, high pressure is applied, and the resulting plate steel can be used in many ways. In the early 1960s, around 10,000 tons of cast iron was produced by Samhwa Steelworks in small-scale blast furnaces, while the Incheon Works produced 200,000 tons of steel ingots annually from melting down scrap iron in open hearth furnaces. The initial 5-year plan of the Park government envisioned the construction of a 300,000-ton capacity steelworks in Ulsan, but financial constraints meant plans had to be shelved. Park Chung-hee, though, was not deterred. In state visit of the U.S. in May 1965, Park met American steelmakers and requested their help. American steelmakers were instrumental in the formation of the Korean International Steel Association. The Economic Planning Board, under Deputy Prime Minister Jang Ki-young, took charge of the steelworks project. The EPB signed the basic agreement on the construction of a combined steelworks with KISA in October 1967. The steelworks to have an annual capacity of 600,000 tons. In April 1968, Pohang Steel Corporation was formed. However, KISA was unable to fulfill the agreement. It failed to persuade the World Bank or the U.S. Import-Export Bank to provide the required loans. Still in spring 1969, the World Bank published a report critical of South Korean plans to build a combined steelworks.
외국 사람이 말하는 뭔가 하니까 너희 나라는 종합제철 할 형편이 아니다 이런 이야기입니다. 우진구에 종합제철 짓는 것은요, 그 영어로 말하면 화이트 엘레판트, 흰 그 백색 코끼리를 갖다 주는 것이다 그런 이야기예요. 왜냐하면 공장만 이제 안 되지 않느냐. 한국도 마찬가지 그거는 코끼리 된다 해가지고 처음부터 반대한 겁니다.
Ultimately, in April 1969, at the International Economic Consultative Organization for Korea in Paris, the KISA plan was scrapped. A new way was needed. Park appointed Kim Hak-yeol as his new Deputy Prime Minister for Economic Affairs, his main task to find a way to get the combined steelworks built.
김학열 씨가 나한테 와가지고 이 청구권 자금 조상 사용을 하기로 청와대에서 결정을 했습니다. 근데 양 국장이 그 교섭을 맡게 양 국장 마음대로 하시오. 앞으로 그래서 양 국장 마음대로 해가지고 이걸 빠른 시일 내에 매듭을 줘주시오. 하는 게 그 양반이 나한테 한 얘기예요.
To make the project work, the government spared no expense, funding the building of needed infrastructure and providing tax breaks. Plant capacity was also enlarged. The steelworks was to have 1 million ton annual capacity. The Japanese went along with the plans. The Japanese sought to lead the project, gaining expertise and creating a reputation.
그때 일본도 수출하려고 굉장히 했을 때거든. 번쩍 들어갈 거 아니야? 몇십억 불짜리 말이지. 종합제철소 하는 게 얼마나 큰 거야. 우리가 사주갔단 말이야, 이게. 거기서 왔다 갔다 하는 길이 더 좋은 거예요.
In December 1969, South Korea and Japan reached a basic agreement for the construction of a combined steelworks in Korea. Japanese steel companies formed a consortium called Japan Group to construct the works in Pohang. $178 million of foreign capital and 49.3 billion won of domestic funds, a total of 120.4 billion won invested. 3 times as much as was the 42.8 billion won invested in the Gyeongbu Expressway, the largest project ever in Korean history. Thus, on 9th June 1973, the dream of an integrated steel mill came true.
출선구가 막혀서 산소 드릴로 다시 뚫고 초조하고 불안하고 저것이 될까 괜찮을까 뭐라고 형용할 수 없는 절박한 심정이 전체 분위기를 지배했는데 마침내 펑 소리가 되면서 그 출선구에서 쇳물이 돼 나오니까 아주 그 빛깔이 영롱하고 형용할 수 없는 창조의 빛깔인데 누가 시킨 것도 아닌데 전부 다 만세하고.
The Pohang Steelworks had the most difficult of beginnings. It was touch and go, but it did eventually see the light of day. And this was principally thanks to the will of Park Chung-hee. The efforts of Jung Gi-young, Kim Hak-yeol, and Park Tae-jun, under Park's leadership, should also not be forgotten.
종합제철은요, 박 대통령이 말하면 베비입니다. 그분이 말하면 잉태를 했고, 그분이 키웠고, 그분이 맺는 겁니다. 그러니까 종합제철 강은요, 박 대통령 때문에 상할 수 없는 겁니다. 예.
The petrochemicals complex and the steelworks were great steps for the country, but the HCI plan accelerated as a result of a national security crisis. In the late 1960s, tensions between North and South Korea escalated as North Korean provocations intensified. This was at the very time when globally, relations between the Soviet Union and the United States were improving. In July 1969, U.S. President Nixon declared that there would be no new deployments of U.S. ground forces in Asia, under what became known as the Nixon Doctrine. Following this, in July 1970, the United States withdrew one of the 2 divisions it had stationed in South Korea. At the same time, the United States began efforts to normalize relations with the People's Republic of China. It appeared as if the United States, that had hitherto defended South Korea, had abandoned it and moved to foreign alliance with its enemy, the People's Republic of China. Park Chung-hee interpreted these changes in the international situation as a potentially existential crisis for the state. He saw no alternative but to pursue an independent defense policy and create a national defense industry capable of producing the weapons. Therefore, in June 1970, the government put in place a plan to build what it termed the 4 core industrial facilities, those being casting metals, special steel, heavy machinery, and shipping. This was a definite indication that the government intended to make armored vehicles and firearms. Individual industrial magnates were entrusted with separate projects, with Hyundai Construction's Jung Ju-young being charged with constructing a shipyard. In August 1970, the government set up the Agency for Defense Development to nurture the emergence of domestic defense industry. However, unable to obtain loans, the 4 core industry facilities plan did not get off the ground. In November 1971, Park Chung-hee appointed Assistant Secretary at the Trade and Industry Ministry, Oh Wan-chul, the second Senior Secretary for Economic Affairs to the President for fostering defense industries. The ADD under Oh Wan-chul produced personal arms and 60mm mortars, codenamed Project Lightning. In just a month, they successfully created prototype carbon rifles and machine guns. Thereafter, they also developed guided missiles and 105mm shells.
신흥인 장군님이 각각 무기가 그렇게 간단한 게 아닙니다. 대포 포신도 영국이나 스웨덴에서 밖에 생산이 안 됩니다. 기관총이나 가비총 모양은 만들어낼 줄 모르지만은 과연 제대로 발사한다고 그런 쉬운 게 아닙니다. 뭐 솔직하니까 이렇게 얘기를 하니까 박 대통령께서 역정을 내시더라고요. 그럼 우리는 어떡하단 말이오? 아니 월맹이 스톱파이프 가지고 파격포를 만들어서도 전쟁을 하고 있는데 우리는 그거보다는 나았을 거 아니오? 바깥에서 100분의 1 정밀도가 있어야 되는데 그런 거 뭐 생각할 수도 없을 정도고 그래서 굉장히 문제가 돼서 역시 무기 개발이라는 건 종합적인 중화학공업화가 돼야 되겠다 하는 이제 그런 결론에 이르는 거죠. 그래서 그때부터는 이제 중화학공업이 아주 착수하게 된 겁니다.
Park Chung-hee's plans did not end with the defense industry. Now in power without term limits, he planned to pursue general HCI. On 17th October 1972, he suddenly declared martial law and suspended the Constitution. Becoming de facto president for life, he constructed a new political system christened the Yushin regime, meaning the revitalizing reform. The representative democracy, in which people choose their own representatives, retreated far back. His new declared aim, $10 billion annual exports and GDP per capita of $1,000 by 1980. The means, heavy and chemical industrialization.
배고플 수출 그걸 박 대통령께서 하겠다. 그거 어떻게 해야 되냐? 중화학공업 해야 됩니다. 이렇게 나오는 거예요. 근데 이 중화학공업 병기하고는 관계가 없어. 겸해서 하겠습니다 하고 나간 거지. 이래서 중화학공업을 우리가 100억 불 수출하기 위해서 맹기는 거예요. 이거.
With exiting light industry, it is impossible to attain the vision of the Yushin regime. $10 billion annual exports and GDP per capita of $1,000 by 1980. Korean economy should move to heavy and chemical industry. Park, now in a one-man dictatorship, could pursue HCI without political interference or opposition. In January 1973, Park declared the beginning of heavy chemical industrialization.
우리나라 공업은 이제 바야흐로 중화학공업 시대에 들어갔습니다. 따라서 정부는 이제부터 중화학공업 육성의 시책의 중점을 두는 중화학공업 정책을 선언하는 바입니다.
In February, the government-wide Committee for the Pursuit of Heavy and Chemical Industry was formed. In June, the plan to foster HCI was released. Steel, non-ferrous metals, machinery, shipping, electronics, and chemicals were the 6 industries targeted for development. By 1981, the target was to increase these industries' share of total economic output to 51%. Park Chung-hee created the HCI team that included Kim Jong-nam, Blue House Chief of Staff, and Oh Won-chol, his second senior secretary for economic affairs. The government moved to designate 1 or 2 companies in a particular industry, regulating and aiding them to realize economies of scale. Deposits from financial institutions were used to create a national investment fund. This was then poured into HCI investment. The HCI companies also benefited from tax breaks. To ensure an adequate supply of technical staff, the government moved to raise enrollment at technical high schools and engineering departments at universities. The number of technical high schools increased 1.6 times, and the number of their students 2.5 times in 8 years. The technical workers raised in those schools grew to the main technological manpower of HCI. The government also established research centers in related fields. The government constructed the basis for these 6 industries. The massive investment in HCI led to what became known as the biggest boom since Dangun, Dangun being the legendary founder of the First Korean dynasty. In the 1976-78 period, annual economic growth exceeded 10%. Over the same period, manufacturing growth reached 16.6% a year. Except for the machine industry, every industry involved exceeded its growth target. While the $10 billion export target was met in late 1977, 4 years early. It was at this time 2 of South Korea's major industries, cars and shipbuilding, were built. In the 1950s, South Koreans made cars by reusing old truck and Jeep parts. The Seaball car, released in 1955, was a representative example. From the 1960s, foreign model complete cars began to be made from imported components. Production increased, but spending on import of car parts required a lot of foreign currency. Dollars, hard-earned from exporting sweaters, plywood, and wigs, were spent on importing expensive car parts. Thus, in the early 1970s, the government sought to begin home production of cars and the parts involved. NG Production, a car assembly company, was told it had to build a body shop. Companies were given permitted production quotas in line with how much of their output was made with domestically produced components. In 1973, the government began encouraging companies to produce their own car models. The first to develop its own model was Kia. In 1974, produced the Brisa 1.0-liter car with an engine designed in-house. Hyundai began developing its own model. An Italian company was contracted to do design, with engines and transmissions handled by Mitsubishi. In October 1974, the Hyundai Pony was developed. South Korea was only the 2nd country in Asia and the 16th in the world to develop its own cars. Hyundai finished building its first car plant in 1975. With the beginning of Hyundai Pony production in 1976, Hyundai seized control of the Korean car market. Thus, it was that in the late 1970s, the Korean car industry began to grow rapidly. With HCI and the construction boom in the Middle East, an economic boom meant that many more could afford to buy cars. From the 1970s, the government also moved to foster the emergence of a shipping industry. Until the late 1960s, the shipping industry had been small in scale and output. There is little internal demand. Domestic shipping companies imported the ships they needed from overseas. The Ministry of Trade and Industry began by ordering a couple of ships in the 20,000 to 30,000 ton range. The Ministry of Trade and Industry got Gulf, the American supplier of South Korea's crude oil, to use South Korean ships for shipment. The Korea Shipbuilding Corporation supplied Gulf with 12 small 20 to 30,000 ton ships. Jung Ju-young of Hyundai Construction had been told by the government to move into shipbuilding, which he duly did by obtaining shipping technology from the UK and even obtaining an order to finance the construction of the company's shipyard. In October 1971, Jung concluded a contract with a Greek shipping company to supply them with two massive 260,000-ton ships at $30.95 million a ship, cheaper than the international price, to be delivered 2.5 years later. The South Korean government agreed to pay the Greek shipping company contract's principal with interest should Hyundai not fulfill its obligations. This is what made the deal possible.
당신이 배를 사주면은 아주 얘기가 국어기죠. 배를 사주면은 사줬다는 증명을 가지고 영국 정부의 승인을 받아서 영국 정부에서 차관을 얻어서 기계를 뭐 사드리고 그래서 여기다 조선소를 지어서 네 배를 만들어줄 테니까 사라 이런 얘기죠.
Thus, Hyundai was able to secure loans worth $50 million, and in March 1972, it began constructing a shipyard in Ulsan. Shipbuilding began soon after, while facilities were still under construction. From 1973 until early 1974, Hyundai built 12 massive 300,000-ton ships. In cooperation with a Japanese shipbuilder, Hyundai obtained design blueprints and also sent personnel to Japan to get technical training. But the company soon ran into difficulties. In late 1973, with the first oil shock, global oil prices increased by 400%. With global economic stagnation, demand for ships collapsed. 3 ships were using delivery dates as an excuse, not accepted by companies that had ordered them. Soon after it had begun operations, Hyundai shipyards were on the brink of bankruptcy. With government support and great efforts, the company survived. Especially the construction boom in the Middle East was a welcome break for Hyundai shipbuilding. Hyundai Construction, its parent company, having won contracts in the Middle East, purchased steel structures made at the shipyards. They were sent across 6,750 miles via sea to construction sites in the Middle East. This saved the company and meant it could survive what was a terrible time for the shipping industry in the late 1970s. In retrospect, from March 1972, when building began, until May 1975, there were over 2,000 safety accidents at the shipyards. However, amid such difficult circumstances, workers and technicians successfully learned how to build ships. In the late 1960s, South Korea's ship industry had productivity of only 5% of Japan's. By 1984, though, it reached 50%. It was this dynamic ability to learn that would ultimately lead to South Korea becoming the world's #1 shipbuilder. It was the blood and sweat of workers, technicians, industrialists, and the government that created the Korean shipbuilding industry. As we have seen, the core industries of South Korea's economy were constructed in the 1970s, while the chaebol began to develop. With heavy chemical industrialization, the large conglomerates commonly known as chaebol grew rapidly. Chaebol are large multi-sector holding corporations, usually controlled by a family. The assistance the government provided to industry during this period was incomparably large compared to times gone before. And with government-mandated monopolies, large conglomerates took shape. The chaebol used cross-shareholding agreements, payment guarantees, internal transactions, and a large core of expert personnel to create a convoy management system. It was so especially when chaebol entered a new industry. This allowed chaebol to minimize risk, construct capacity, and become settled in a new industry.
대우자동차가 오늘 끝내 최종 부도 처리됐습니다.
But this also created a concentration of economic power that led sometimes to excessive expansion and chain bankruptcies. Chaebol industrialists contributed massively to South Korea's rapid economic growth. But these emperor-like business leaders constructed monopolies that also burdened the economy to some extent.
(1979년 10월 26일) 밤 대한민국의 박정희 대통령이 서거했습니다.
With the sudden death of Park Chung-hee in October 1979 and the resulting political crisis, the economic crisis the country faced also worsened. In 1980, the economy contracted by 3%, the first time in 2 decades. The new military dictatorship led by Chun Doo-hwan saw Park Chung-hee's HCI as the cause of the economic crisis. It was here that the new government sought to distinguish itself from the previous government.
70년대 우리나라의 중화학공업이 막대한 양의 선투자를 필요하고 그다음에 규모의 경제에 의존하는 몇 개 산업에 집중돼 있었기 때문에 세계 수요가 예상보다 못할 경우에는 필연적으로 금융 위기로 번질 가능성을 내포하고 있는 이제 계획이었습니다. 그래서 중화공업의 전체적으로 잘 됐다, 잘못됐다 이렇게 얘기하는 게 아니라 좀 너무 급하게 과도하게 추진된 것이 아닌가.
The new military government ended the Ministry of Trade and Industry's HCI line and put the Senior Secretary for Economic Affairs to the President Kim Jae-ik from Economic Planning Board in charge of economic policy. The government attempted to restructure investment in the particularly badly performing car and electricity generation equipment industries. New entry into these industries was prohibited, and the industries were restructured. The Chun Doo-hwan government also changed industrial policy, intended preferential treatment and aid to particular companies within particular industries. The 7 industry support laws were repealed. Instead, a law that provided generalized support to industry on the functionality basis adopted. These changes were designed to rectify problems with existing industrial policy, but also were in line with liberalizing economic trends worldwide. Neoliberalism was on the rise, the Thatcher government in Britain, and the Reagan administration in the United States led the charge to cut government regulation and liberalize markets. At the same time, to stabilize the economy, anti-inflationary policies were put in place. And the government implemented a set of policies put actively designed to forcibly stabilize industrial relations, suppressing the labor movement, banning plural unions, and prohibiting third-party strike actions. This proved to be a great help to nascent heavy and chemical industry. These economic stabilization and rationalization policies resulted in rapid growth, returning in the early 1980s. And in 1986 to 88, the economy boomed, thanks to the explosive increase of export. The Korean economy grew over 11% annually for these 3 years. It was the car industry that expanded particularly rapidly in this period. With government reorganization in the early 1980s, only 2 car companies were left, but the viability of the industry appeared to be in doubt. For vulnerable Korean car industry to survive, investment should be concentrated in small model cars, mass production for export. In October 1981, Hyundai put in place the X-Car project to make 300,000 cars a year. This was a plan to make more cars in a year than the 267,000 cars registered within South Korea at the time. The World Bank was pessimistic about this investment's prospects, but the tide had just turned. With the U.S.-Japanese trade deficit rising, the Japanese yen appreciated, and the Japanese car industry cut back on exports of small cars to the U.S. The U.S. small car market unexpectedly opened up. This presented a big opportunity for the Korean car industry. Hyundai Pony Excel exports grew rapidly, Exports of 16,000 units in 1983 rose to 564,000 in just 5 years. It was one of the 10 hit products in the United States at the time. The Daewoo Le Mans and the Kia Pride also soon became big exports. The Korean car industry, with constant improvements in performance and active marketing, has grown into the 5th largest worldwide. In the 1980s, another industry that succeeded was semiconductors. In the mid-1960s, the industry had begun with simple assembly from components produced overseas. From the mid-1970s, using wafer processing, Samsung began producing products through transistor large-scale integration. In 1983, Samsung's Lee Byung-cho designated semiconductors a key industry for the firm and entered the DRAM market. Samsung's other main rivals, LG and Hyundai, followed suit. This was to be a fierce fight for market share. In November 1983, Samsung developed 64K DRAM. In October 1984, it successfully developed 256K DRAM. They had an expertise gap of 5 years compared to the most advanced makers. And this was not an easy market to compete in. Dumping by Japanese companies meant that DRAM prices collapsed in 1985. In September 1984, when Samsung was releasing its first semiconductor product, 64K DRAM cost $3. The price fell to 30 cents in August 1985. It cost Samsung $1.70 to produce 64K DRAM. In 1985, Samsung made an astronomical 130 billion won loss. Hyundai and LG were in a similar position. Fortunately, from 1986, market conditions improved. DRAM prices rose. The government felt pressed to invest in research. The gap in product development with Japan was shortened. In 9 years, Korean RAM was of the same level as American and Japanese. Finally, in the 1990s, South Korea began to export DRAM in large quantities. As PC ownership increased rapidly worldwide, demand for DRAM also soared. Orders for South Korean DRAM rolled in. From 1993, South Korea became the #1 maker of semiconductor memory worldwide, and it was the 3rd largest producer of semiconductors generally, with only the United States and Japan producing more. In 1995, Samsung became the first Korean company to make profits over 1 trillion won. Beginning with steel, petrochemicals, and shipbuilding, and even cars, HCI was the motive force behind Korea's economic rise. The government systematically planned its development. With the ambition of entrepreneurs and rapid learning abilities, as well as industrialness of workers and engineers, Korean HCI leaped forward. Thus, South Korea succeeded in conquering the commanding heights of industry, constructing industries that many thought it could not.
A huge number of Koreans moved out of the countryside and into Seoul, put their children in good classes. Korea is a success in that dimension. They're always moving into some new, hard area and getting good enough at it so they're competing with the best.
In some sense, Koreans are the most ambitious people I know. And that means they are working hard and trying to achieve more and more, particularly on the economic side, because people want to have better conditions for themselves and for their children in their lives.
There were many difficulties encountered on this road. Many investments resulted in years of losses, or sometimes outright failure. But success ultimately resulted in South Korea being able to rub shoulders with the developed nations of the world
평가는 그 시간 프레임을 얼마나 짧게 길게 보냐에 따라서 평가 다 할 수 있는 것 같아요. 그래 가령 뭐 우리나라에 지금 뭐 삼성 대표되는 기업이 잘하는 반도체도 7년 동안 적자였거든요. 중화학공업도 똑같은 거죠. 그렇지만은 7년이라는 적자 기간을 버텨주고 나니까 이제 그때부터 수익이 나타난 것이고, 중화학공업 투자도 단기적으로는 적자였지만은 그것을 통해서 한국이 많은 것을 배우고 실패나 시도 없이는 배울 수 없는 거죠.
HEI meant that South Korea became one of the world's 10th leading economic powers, paving the way for a brighter future.